When I pick up my phone during this week, I am confronted by two very serious realities. On the one hand, we find news of sort of very, very dreadful things, of people dying, of being faced with the reality of pain and suffering in a very real sense. And as I scroll down, just without blinking, I'm confronted with hope and new life and great things happening in communities all around our country. And so my question this morning is, how do we sort of deal with both of these tensions? Between, on the one hand, being confronted with death and the seriousness of pain and suffering, and on the other hand, with life in abundance and joy and peace. Especially in a time like this, we are confronted with this. And there's a beautiful story in the Gospel of John where Jesus is in a place with his disciples, and they get news that one of Jesus' friends, Lazarus, has fallen ill, and Jesus knows that Lazarus is actually dead. And interestingly, Jesus decides for 2 days to wait before visiting Lazarus. Eventually, when Jesus gets to Lazarus, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. And from our lectionary reading, we pick up the story from there, from where Jesus enters into the town of Bethany to visit the family of Lazarus. Let's read it together.
On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had to come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews, who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept.
So, as you can imagine, when we read this text, when Jesus enters Bethany, Martha and Mary were rightfully upset with Jesus. And there were many reasons to be upset with Jesus. And so first we meet the first sister, Martha, as Jesus approaches her, and we see how she confronts him with this one very simple but very deep sentence. And that is, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And I wonder how many of us during this week and during this time have that same confrontational question on our hearts. "Lord, if you had been here, my brothers, my sisters would not have died." And then Jesus' reply, we find directly after Martha had said this. And Jesus' reply is quite amazing, and it might be sort of seen as the summary of this whole sort of scripture reading. Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And then Jesus asks her, do you believe this? This is such a striking answer for me. On the one hand, Jesus starts his reply with that famous phrase we get always in the New Testament, throughout the New Testament, and throughout the Old Testament, I am. And whenever we read that, we should hear sort of a flickering of something is being said here that's very important. And that thing is that when Jesus identifies himself as the I am, Jesus identifies himself with the God that has created the whole universe. Because from the start, from Adam and Eve, it was the I am that was present when Adam and Eve was created. It was also the same I am that was present when Abraham and Sarah got a child where there was death previously. It was also, says the prophet Ezekiel, this I am that was present when the bones got flesh and came to life in Ezekiel. And so when Jesus says that I am, then Martha should have heard in this that she's standing next to the God of life. And what Jesus is essentially giving her is an invite to see in her pain and in her suffering new life and new hope in the person of Jesus. In her suffering, God lets her know, Martha, I am with you. The God who brings life is with you. And then she replies with this beautiful confession saying that, yes, Lord, I believe this. In fact, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into this world. Now, isn't that beautiful? I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into this world. And then Martha goes away and she calls her sister Mary, and Mary comes onto the scene, but in a different way. She runs out of her room, people following her, and she falls to Jesus' feet. But then as soon as she fell down, she's got exactly the same confrontational question for Jesus. Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. In some way, we are in a similar predicament in the world today. And we have the same questions on our heart. And so this is my question to you this morning. How does Jesus react in situations like these? From there on, we see how Jesus moves not triumphantly, not with a big bang into the world, just raising Lazarus. No, we see how Jesus moves from there, and the text says it beautifully. When Jesus saw their tears, he was deeply moved in spirit, and he was troubled. In fact, the King James says it beautifully. It says he groaned in spirit. And the Message translation even says that deep anger welled up in him. These two beautiful Greek verbs. And indeed, Jesus was angry. Now the question is, why was Jesus angry? Why was Jesus so moved and troubled when he saw their crying? Was it because maybe Martha and Mary didn't believe hard enough? Or was it maybe because the mourners and the groaners standing around didn't see what Jesus was doing in that moment with Martha? Maybe that's true. But maybe it was because Jesus was angered, troubled, moved, groaning because of death entering once again into this human world. And another person had died that day. And then the Gospel of John goes on in the most emotive way that John can express himself to say, and then Jesus wept. Jesus cried with Martha and Mary and all of the people standing around Lazarus' grave that day. I mean, that is really serious. If we believe that Jesus is a God who cries, I mean, that says a lot to us in this time today. One of my favorite bloggers and theologians, Debbie Moore, says it beautifully. She says, when Jesus wept that day, something changed in all of us. And then she mentions 6 things. She says, when Jesus weeps, Jesus legitimizes human grief. Jesus doesn't move past it or negates it or laughs at it. Jesus weeps, and in that way he legitimizes our very real experiences of suffering. Secondly, she says, when Jesus weeps, he honors the complexities of our sorrows and our joys. They really lost a person that day. All the memories, all the things that they knew of Lazarus, even if he had to come back to life, they still lost those things because he would come back in another way, in a different way. They will have new stories. So the pain and the suffering and the grief were still very real and very raw. And Jesus saw that. Thirdly, she says, when Jesus weeps, he respects the necessity of silence. You know, we as Christians or as pastors or as believers or whatever are very often so quick to give a word or a phrase or condolences or songs or beautiful messages to one another in times of grief. And that's wonderful. But what Jesus is telling us here is that maybe silence and weeping is a way that we can show our faith. And then fourthly, she says, when Jesus weeps, he honors the nuances of faith. Faith is not only triumphant and big, faith is also crying and weakness and being there in the moment in suffering. In the 5th instance, he says that when Jesus weeps, he acknowledges his own mortality. Indeed, in this text we learn that Jesus is really a human. And Jesus sees the prospect of his death coming nearer, and he knows that he too is going to die. And maybe he respects the gift of life so much that it is worth crying about. And then finally she says, when Jesus weeps, he shows us that sorrow is a powerful catalyst for change. In the story of Lazarus, it is the shared lament of Martha and Mary and the people by the grave that leads to transformation. It is moving through the grief and the pain and the suffering that we can enter into new life. But we can't get there if we don't move through that suffering and that pain. When that is said and done, when we take that really seriously, well, maybe then we can start to read the second part of this story.
Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go."
And indeed, this is the miracle. Lazarus gets from the grave still wrapped in linen, and everybody can see and witness that he's been restored back into his community. In just the next text, John 12, we read how Lazarus is sitting around the table with his friends and family and Jesus. And this is really the miracle. But another miracle happened that day, and I want us to really see that. Martha and Mary discovered that when they met Jesus in their suffering, Jesus came to stand right beside them, and they believed that Jesus was really the answer of life. And so this is my very simple message this morning. In this time of suffering, we can believe that this same Spirit and this same power that resurrected Lazarus from the dead was also the same Spirit and the same power that was present in Martha and Mary, facilitating them from death to life. And indeed, this is also the same Spirit and the same power that is present in every one of us as we move from death to life. It is in our mortality, it is in our most vulnerable place, in the heart of this crisis, where God meets us where we are. And suddenly, the impossible becomes possible. In a sense, this is a beautiful baptismal text, because in the same way that Martha and Mary was going through death to life, all of us, if we get to know that life is found in Jesus, move from death to life. Not only once, but at several junctures in our life, and often at the most difficult places, in the crises, in the suffering, in the pain. That is where Jesus, the Lord of life, comes to stand next to us. Amen.